Afternoon and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Library. I'm John Shattuck, CEO of the Kennedy Library Foundation, and on behalf of myself and Deborah Leff, the library's director, we're very pleased to present another in our series of presidential candidate forums. We want to thank our sponsors, Fleet Financial, Boston Capital, the Lowell Institute, Boston Globe, and WBUR and Boston.com. And before I introduce our distinguished guest this afternoon, I want to put in a special plug for the Kennedy Library Museum. If you want a really good sense of what a tough political campaign for president was all about, go and visit our museum, and you will see the events that unfolded in 1960. And I can tell you that reduced admission coupons are now available to all of our forum audiences, and please feel free to pick one up on your way out. Our speaker tonight hails from the great northwest region of New England, the state of Vermont. And as a part-time, long-time Vermonter for myself for more than 30 years, I'm very proud tonight to be able to introduce Governor Howard Dean to our large and always enthusiastic Kennedy Library audience. When John F. Kennedy announced for president himself in 1960, he spoke about the presidency in words that reflect, perhaps now more than ever, the challenges we face as a nation. He said, "The presidency is the most powerful office in the world. It is in the presidency that the most crucial decisions of this century must be made in the next 4 years, giving direction to our moral purpose, awakening every American to the dangers and opportunities that confront us." Governor Dean, I know, likes to introduce himself as the presidential candidate from the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. But since we have many candidates represented here, I know we'll get a chance to see many wings. I'm sure he'll have more to say about that tonight, but in reviewing his record as governor, there's plenty of evidence that he's a champion of Democratic causes. He served for governor for 12 years, longer than anyone else in Vermont history, I believe, winning re-election 5 times and always by large margins. His career as governor was marked by what the Burlington Free Press calls an equal emphasis on creating jobs, balancing budgets, and expanding government activism, the secret to his stunning political success. Howard Dean describes himself as a common-sense moderate who believes that social justice can be accomplished through strong fiscal management. As governor, he has a record of reducing Vermont's long-term debt, cutting the income tax twice, creating tens of thousands of new jobs, and increasing the state's minimum wage. He also guaranteed health coverage to every child in Vermont under 18 and expanded programs to help seniors afford prescription drugs. He's been a champion of environmental protection, preserving forests, closing landfills, and reducing pollution. He has been a leader on justice issues, cracking down on domestic violence, putting Vermont in the forefront on child support collections, and signing the nation's first gay rights civil union legislation. In recent months, he has been an outspoken critic of the Bush administration's unilateralist approach to foreign policy and national security, and tonight I know he will share with us his views of what's at stake for America as our president calls for massive tax cuts while leading us into war, presiding over a faltering economy while asserting American power in unprecedented ways. Governor Dean will make opening remarks for about 15 minutes, and then we'll engage in a conversation with our wonderful guest, who we are very fortunate to have with us here tonight, one of America's foremost political journalists, Joe Klein. Joe Klein writes, I'm sure you all know that Joe Klein writes a weekly Time magazine column in the arena on national and international affairs. Earlier this year, he published his 5th book, The Natural, Bill Clinton's misunderstood presidency. And in 1996, he was the anonymous author of the best-selling novel Primary Colors, a loosely camouflaged account of Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign, which later became a Hollywood box office success as a film. Before joining Time, Joe was an award-winning columnist for Newsweek, New York Magazine, and Rolling Stone. He began his career right here in Boston, I'm pleased to note, as a reporter for WGBH-TV and later as news editor of The Real Paper. Please join me again in welcoming Governor Howard Dean and Joe Klein to the stage at the Kennedy Library. Governor.
Thank you. This is an erudite an erudite federal site, so I will not be giving the raw meat speech that I gave at the Democratic National Convention, although evidently there are those in the audience that wish I would. Let me thank John and also Deborah Leff, who is the director of the Kennedy Library, very, very much for your extraordinary hospitality. What I'm going to do is just for a few moments go through a list of issues, some of which I'll talk in some depth about, but not a great deal in just 15 minutes, because I thought we would get into the depth of the discussion, both in Joe's interview, which I look forward to with some trepidation, having read Primary Colors twice, and also to hear your own questions. Let me first start out with Iraq. As many of you know, that I am the only candidate who is running in the leadership in the polls, or close to it, that did not support the president's policy in Iraq. But and we'll discuss why that was, I'm sure, during the period. But I want to make it very, very clear that I think it's important for us to support our troops. And I don't think there's a contradiction there. Some have thought that there is, but I remember well the experience in Vietnam where our troops came home and felt that they had lost the respect of the American people. And I think it's very important for us to remember that they are going to be sacrificing their lives. Some of them are in captivity now. So what I would just ask for a moment of silence on behalf of our troops and on behalf of their families, who are, I think, suffering greatly with worry at home, as we wish for a very speedy conclusion to what we're doing in Iraq. Thank you. John talked about fiscal policy, and let me just talk briefly about the confluence of issues in the bigger picture and the reason that I decided to run for president. There are two things that matter enormously to the future of America. These are not issues that I believe that we need to set forth a new path on necessarily. This is not talking about health insurance. Of course we want health insurance for all Americans, but that doesn't matter enormously to the future of America. The future of America depends on two things. It depends on how we present ourselves to the world, and it depends on how strong we can be economically. And I'm deeply, deeply worried about the course that we're engaged on now. Abroad, on September 12th, 2001, headlines all over the world, particularly in France, said that today we are all Americans. It seems to me that we have squandered all that goodwill and all that sympathy in only 18 months. And I tell a very simple story, an allegory, when I get asked about this in front of high school classes. I talk about the biggest, toughest, strongest kid in the high school class. And if that person is on the student council or plays on the football team or the dramatic association or maybe is on the honor roll, that person is a respected leader in their high school. And if that person's attitude is simply, get out of my way or I'll see you afterwards in the parking lot, then that person is a very feared person in that high school, but is not respected. We have chosen the latter course and not the former as the United States, as the most powerful country on earth. And it pains me deeply to think that my daughter, who very much wants to go abroad in a couple of years as a semester in a foreign country, might not be able to do that because she's an American, and her safety cannot be guaranteed, even in the capitals of our allies. That is what the notion that might makes right breeds in American foreign policy, and I think that we ought to embrace what Abraham Lincoln said during the Civil War, which is that right makes might. Morality matters in foreign policy. I got into politics in 1980 because Jimmy Carter was the first president in America that connected human rights with foreign policy in a significant and meaningful and consistent way, although his precursor was the person that this center is named after. What America does sets the tone and the bar for other nations' behavior. And I can almost promise you, if anyone can promise anything about the future, that sometime in the next 3 or 4 years, another country will invoke a preemption doctrine in order to strike at a weaker country because they covet something that they have. Why not the Chinese singling out Taiwan as possessing missiles and therefore being worthy of an attack? Morality does matter. It doesn't govern the behavior of other nations, but politics and public opinion and world opinion are all interlinked. It is not an accident that when the World Trade Center was brought down by Osama bin Laden and Palestinian children in the refugee camps jumped for joy that Yasser Arafat sought to repress the television pictures of that happening. Why? Because he knew what world opinion would think. World opinion matters to everybody, and what people think of the United States and the regard that they hold the morality of our foreign policy in matters. And I have simply disagreed with the President because I have never made the assessment that Iraq is an immediate threat. They did not possess nuclear weapons. They did not possess a credible nuclear program, and there was very little evidence that they'd ever given weapons of mass destruction to terrorists. We gave them, in fact, weapons of mass destruction. On the contrary, North Korea possesses a nuclear program, probably possesses nuclear weapons, and sells missiles to countries that are our enemies. They are a far greater danger. We need now to begin bilateral negotiations with North Korea. We need now to begin the discussions that will have inspectors on the ground in North Korea with agreements by them to stop their nuclear program at once in return for a guarantee that we will not attack them in writing. And we need now to return to the agreements that we had under the Clinton administration, verified this time by inspectors on the ground, which will call for them to dismantle their nuclear program in return for fuel, food, and diplomatic recognition. I understand that this president is very much against constructive engagement, but this president was one of the biggest beneficiaries, as the United States was, of a constructive engagement when early in his term a Chinese fighter ran into one of our spy planes, precipitated an incident that was over in 10 days. The reason that incident was over in 10 days is because the Chinese knew very well that they had hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade with America at stake should that become a major diplomatic incident, and it did not become one. Constructive engagement works. Bill Clinton proved it works, and the Democrats ought to stand up for that kind of a policy. And in the long range, the danger is enormous because under no circumstances can we permit the Korean Peninsula to be nuclearized. That is an imminent danger to the United States. A war with North Korea would be far more daunting and dangerous to the world and to everyone in that region. We must start negotiating now so that we do not find ourselves in the same position that we found ourselves with Saddam Hussein. Let me talk about domestic policy. The other most critical piece what I see as the great danger for America is our economic policy and fiscal policy. I believe we are embarked essentially on using Argentina as our model for fiscal policy. It's true. Borrow and spend, borrow and spend, borrow and spend, deficits be damned, whatever you have to do to tell every interest group that you want that they'll get what they want. Here we have the largest deficit in the history of the United States, 2 years after we had the largest surplus in the history of the United States, and the President is promising a Medicare prescription drug benefit. They just passed, with Democratic help yesterday, a $350 billion tax cut on top of the largest deficit, on top of the war that nobody has any idea how they're going to pay for. It's really like the old ad in the 1960s, promise them anything and give them our page. We'll be very lucky to get our page. We saw what our page looked like for Argentina, and it's not pretty. One of the largest and most important and most significant problems in this country, which I keep telling my conservative friends that they ought to have a stake in, is the enormous growing gap between the wealthy and the poor in this country. And even if you're not motivated by humanitarian and social justice, even if you're a conservative business person who doesn't care about social justice, you ought to pay attention, because historically, the result of the enormous gap in any country between the wealthy and the poor is civil unrest. We all have a stake in not repeating what went on in the Depression. And this president's policies frighten me greatly, because we are taking money out of the Social Security Trust Fund and giving them an IOU in order to cut taxes for people who make $300,000 a year. I simply do not wish to engage in class warfare, but I think that's just bad public policy. If you give tax cuts to people who have high discretionary incomes, they don't spend the money. And that's what this president's chosen to do to stimulate the economy. Let me tell you how I want to stimulate the economy. The first thing I want to do is reform the healthcare system. No, excuse me, I don't want to reform the healthcare system. I want to include everybody in the healthcare system. And in order to include everybody in the healthcare system, you can't actually reform the system, because what happens when you do that is the Democrats all fight among ourselves about how we should have a single payer, managed care, employer-based, and then the interest groups come in and finance Harry and Louise to kill the plan. And they do. What we need is to do what we did in Vermont. What John said is true. Everybody in Vermont, 99% are eligible for health insurance. 96% have it. I simply want to expand Medicare, Medicaid, and an employer-based system to cover everybody. If you do that, you don't just insure everybody and join every other industrial country in the world that guarantees health insurance for everybody. You also stimulate small business. Now, if you want to stimulate the economy, the most important sector to look at is small business. Why? Because small businesses create more jobs than anybody else. My first trip to Iowa, one of the great things about running for president, that's what I think they call that a smattering of applause. One of the great things about running for president is you learn while you campaign, because if you listen to people, you can pick up a lot of things. One of the things I learned when I went to Iowa the first time, which was more than a year ago, is that folks don't trust corporate America anymore, and not because of Enron and Arthur Andersen, but because they are fundamentally convinced that American corporations are not really American anymore. Because even though they pay good benefits and they pay good wages, that they'll move their jobs and their assets to any other country in order to maximize their return. I went home after that early trip to Iowa, and I had a cabinet meeting. I said, look, we've been doing economic development wrong in this country. We've done it here wrong in Vermont. Because small businesses are much more difficult to deal with. You have to deal with 20 of them to get 300 jobs instead of one. They can't hire architects and engineers. They're more likely to go into bankruptcy, and therefore more taxpayer money is at risk when you help them. But the truth is that small businesses not only create jobs, more jobs than large corporations, they don't move to China. That That is a critical piece. We have spent an enormous amount of money in this country shoring up large companies that take their production offshore. We need to do this differently. If you adopt and you support my health plan, if Congress adopts my health plan, the details of which I'm sure Joe will extract from me or else you will in the question period, what happens is about $100 billion worth of health insurance that's now being bought by small business people who can barely afford it is now being bought by the government. That is an enormous economic stimulus, and it goes to the sector that will use economic stimulus to create jobs. Individual tax cuts don't, but directly targeting those folks that are most likely to hire in ones and twos and threes the people and create the climate which is going to turn around our economy, that's the sector that we need to stimulate, and the health care plan does that because it takes off the table one of the greatest expenses for any small business. I used to go to small businesses in our state and say, take your kid, the kids of your employees who make less than $50,000 a year, off your rolls and put them on ours. It is cheap to take care of kids. You'll never have to buy another family policy again. You can just pay for the employee and the spouse, and that money flows through to your bottom line. You will prosper, and ultimately the economy will prosper. Secondly, I want a program for small business that allows capital formation. Small businesses can't borrow money, even when interest rates are at 1.5%, because lenders are afraid to lend, especially in an economy where their future may be uncertain. It is a very simple matter to set up a Sallie Mae or something equivalent to a high-yield bond fund to collateralize these loans with an enormous risk pool so that if a few expected folks don't make it, at a higher percentage of than is the case in large corporations, that those risks and losses are spread across a wide group of investors, and the model is very clear. Thirdly, and this stimulates not just small businesses, but all businesses, instead of cutting taxes by $1.7 trillion, wouldn't it have been better to take a page from Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Wouldn't it have been better for the future of our economy to create jobs now and infrastructure for later? Wouldn't it have been better to rebuild our sewer and our water capacity, to rebuild our airports and our trains and our roads? Wouldn't it have been better to invest in the broken down schools in inner city America all over this country, create jobs now, and for 70 years from now have something to show for our $1.7 trillion investment? Let me close by saying this. John said that I like to quote Paul Wellstone and call myself the Democrat representing the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. What I mean by that is very simple. It doesn't place me in a particular place on the spectrum. I want a Democrat who will stand up again for Democratic Party principles. What are we doing arguing about the Patient's Bill of Rights in Congress when somebody in our party ought to be standing up for health care for every American? If we don't talk about these issues, it's never going to happen. What are we doing being silent when the President of the United States uses the word quota 8 times on national television? There are no quotas now at the University of Michigan. There never has been quotas. Quota is a racially loaded word designed to appeal to people's fears of losing their jobs that are places in our best schools to folks of color. This country depends on all of us uniting as a people, building a community, standing together. That's what this country is all about. I am tired of being divided by race. I am tired of being divided by income. I am tired of being divided by gender. I am tired of being divided by sexual orientation. I am tired of taking my orders for the fundamentalist preachers and the right-wing talk show hosts. I plan to stand up for an America that we built in my generation, an America that struggles every day but is committed to equal justice under the law for all Americans, an America that struggles every day but understands the hard work that working people have to do to put food on their tables, working 3 jobs and 2-parent families, to hope one day their kids may be able to go to college too. I want America to stand up for itself. I want our country back, and we're going to take it back, and you're going to help me. Thank you very, very much.
Well, clearly a heavy-duty Republican audience here.
They just want their country back.
Maybe I'll try and represent the Republican wing of the Democratic Party. I think the war is on everybody's mind. It's front and center. And let me ask you a few questions about it. And the first is how, I think we all agree, it's clear everybody agrees that we have to support our troops. How best do we do that? There are 115 nations at the United Nations today, I think, that proposed a resolution that we stop now and withdraw. There are some people who would argue that that's the best way to support our troops. Others, like General Barry McCaffrey last night, argued that the best way to support our troops is to put 200,000 more troops into the war zone. And that seems to be the emerging view of a lot of the old-line Pentagon sorts. And then there are people who would say, let's just prosecute the war as it's being prosecuted now. Which of those 3 paths would you take?
I don't, for me to answer that question doesn't make any sense. I have no idea what the intelligence from the field shows. If it were up to me, we wouldn't be there now because we would have gone to the United Nations and continued the inspections and continued to disarm Iraq, which we were. So for me to make a choice about that's a complete Hobson's choice. I didn't get us into this. Unfortunately, I'm not president now, and I can't get us out of this. But I do think that at least as we voice our opinions, and I think we should continue to voice our opinions about the war, that we ought to be supportive and differentiate the fact that, or differentiate ourselves into supporting the troops and saying we don't support the policy, at least as somebody who supports the war. But I can't really legitimately and knowledgeably discuss the strategic implications of whether to withdraw right this minute or not. There are all kinds of complications that have to do with safety of our troops, where we are, America's prestige in the world. That's a very complicated subject, and I just don't think it makes any sense for me to wade into that, particularly when I have no idea what the intelligence reports are.
Well, I know politicians hate hypotheticals, but this is a hypothetical. If you were president of the United States at this moment, you opposed this war. There are a number of people, there are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets all over the world saying that we should stop the fighting now and withdraw. What do you say to them?
I say, I'm not the President of the United States. I didn't get us into this, and I'm not answering your hypothetical question. But it was a good try.
So you're not going to go out and march in the streets anytime soon?
No.
Okay.
Only because I'm marching in the streets of Iowa, New Hampshire, and California so often. I am going to continue to speak out, though, Joe. I think one of the things that is great about this country, and we have to remember this, is that the difference between the United States of America and Iraq is that it is not unpatriotic to speak your mind, even if it means disagreeing with the President of the United States.
Which brings me to the other part of the question. I noticed that in your formulation you supported the troops, but you didn't say anything about the President of the United States. There was a fair amount of dismay among Democrats during the Kosovo campaign when that great patriotic American Tom DeLay would support the troops but refused to support the President of the United States. Are Are you supporting the actions of the President of the United States now as well as the troops?
No,
Or?
no, because to support the actions of the president would be supporting his policy. To support the office of the presidency, of course, but I don't support this president's policy, and I made that very clear.
So you're supporting the troops, but not the president's policy, and you're not. Okay, I'll let it go. You've
now you see what I deal with every single day on the campaign trail. No wonder Kerry and I have spats about who says what when.
Wait a second. Here you are. You're running for president of the United
Right.
States. We are at one of the greatest moments of crisis during both of our lifetimes. We're about the same age. And I think that the public has some right to know how you would act in this sort of situation.
No, Joe, this is great. This is really good. This is live media and good cinema verite. What you're trying to do...
I'm not embedded here.
What you're trying to do is... Pardon? Well, that's what we should have done in the first place. What you're trying to do is basically get me to give an answer to a hypothetical question that I really can't give you, because I don't know what the intelligence reports are. I've made it clear what my position on the policy is. I think the public knows what my position on the policy is. To put me in the position of answering a hypothetical question about what I would do if I were the President of the United States, it's an easy answer. I'm sure I could get a ton of cheers from everybody in this room if I said, just get them out right now. But the truth is, I became governor because the governor died of a heart attack at 63 years old, totally unexpectedly. I was doing a physical in my office. I got a phone call saying I was the next governor of the state of Vermont on 5 minutes' notice. So what I learned through that experience is sometimes you are president the next day. And when you are president the next day or governor the next day, you have got to have some consistency. And I'm very careful about how I answer hypothetical questions because of that experience.
Okay. Let's move on to another hypothetical. How
we could just talk about policy or something.
Well,
like that.
it's a hypothetical about policy. Assuming that in many parts of the world this policy hasn't won us very many friends, as you said, how would you, and also taking into account a remark that the Vice President Cheney made on Meet the Press a few weeks ago, saying that the institutions, alliances, and arrangements of the last 50 years are becoming obsolete and have to be changed. How do we go about? First of all, do you agree with Cheney on that? And then, secondly, how do we go about reconstructing our role in the world after this current campaign is over?
Well, it's a really interesting question because actually I thought when the president, I should stop touching that. When the president first took office, I actually thought that, even though, of course, I wasn't as supportive as I could have been, I actually thought that his outreach to Mexico and Latin America was very promising because I think the United States has ignored, to our detriment and Latin America's detriment, our nearest and most important hemispheric neighbor. So I thought that in some ways what Dick Cheney said makes sense, although he didn't mean it that way.
How do you think he meant it?
Well, I think the way he meant it is let's not pay so much attention to the United Nations and European institutions and our European allies, and I think that is a mistake. However, if you interpret something which I'm pretty sure he didn't mean, which is to say that we really ought to be building relationships with countries that we haven't formally built relationships. For example, when Lula took over Brazil as the president, the first democratically elected president from the working class in Brazil's history, I was apprehensive because I didn't know what kind of fiscal policies he was going to pursue. He's done an incredible job. We ought to ally with him because he is the first democratic president in Brazil's history who has stood up for doing something about the enormous gap between the wealthy and the poor in Brazil. If that's what you mean by changing the old order and the old institutions, that's very positive. I suspect that perhaps Vice President Cheney didn't mean that. But those are the kinds of things that we ought to be doing.
How do you think?
And the second part of your question is how do you repair this? It's actually not as difficult as it sounds. The first thing you need to do is change presidents. And then But one of the things I learned by being governor as long as I was, that if you embarrass somebody publicly and humiliate them publicly, it's incredibly difficult to do business with them later on. When we had recalcitrant legislators that didn't want to support things that I thought were important, I rarely humiliated them publicly. We'd always try to get them in the office, work out the differences. If they didn't work out so well, then you twist their arm a little. But in order to get things done, you've got to allow people to save face. I was in South Korea shortly after the Axis of Evil speech. Not only were the South Koreans horrified, but our own diplomatic corps was horrified, and I don't think that's completely unrelated to what the North Koreans are doing now. If you want to have friends and influence people, and we could use a few friends in the world, you've got to, as they say in kindergarten, you've got to be a friend to have a friend, and that's our problem in foreign policy.
Could I... Specifically in the Islamic world, and even more specifically in the Arab world, do you think that our policy in Iraq has hurt us with them or helped us? And if it's hurt us, how do we go about specifically repairing that?
Well, I think there's a two-way street here. Our relationships with much of the Arab world are crippled by our dependence on foreign oil. We have really got to do something about oil conservation in this policy, in this country, other than just drill. Really enthusiastic audience. Other than just drill in Anwar. I think that, and the reason for that is, for example, we have a very ambivalent and difficult relationship with the Saudis. The Saudis are ostensibly our friends. They probably don't like Saddam very much. They have said things that are in the Arab world that clearly cater to so-called Arab Street. But they are also financing madrasas, fundamental Islamic schools, which teach small children in the Islamic world, all over the Islamic world, to hate Americans, Christians, and Jews. Now that is the next generation of suicide bombers. We need to openly speak about that, because anybody who teaches hate anywhere, whether it's in America's borders or out of America's borders, is doing something that's inimical to what America stands for. So our relationship with the Arab world is already very complicated. I think it would be much more straightforward if we took a more direct approach to the things that we think need to be changed, and we took a more respectful approach to the Arab world as sovereign nations. It is in our best interests, from a defense point of view and from a humanitarian point of view, to promote democracy everywhere, including in the Arab world. It is very difficult to take an institution that has not changed for 3,000 years, that has no experience with democracy, and suddenly expected to become a democratic institution overnight. We can work on it. We can do things to build middle-class values in Arab states, but it's very, very difficult to do it when our relationship with Arab states depends on propping up dictatorships and corrupt regimes, because we're dependent on their oil, and that's what we've done.
Let's go on to what you were talking about before, your health plan. You talked about providing support for small businesses. How would you do that? Would you do it through an employer mandate? Would you do it through tax credits? How would you do it?
No, my health care plan is based on what can pass. I'm a complete pragmatist about health care. I've been doing this for 20 years. My observations, I think, were true. The Carter plan and the Clinton plan both failed because it got so complicated the Americans couldn't understand it. I think one of the things I've come to understand after all the time I've spent in government is that Americans are conservative with a small c. That is, Americans don't like too much change too fast as a group. And what Harry and Louise did, and most of you are old enough to remember Harry and Louise from 10 years ago, was to appeal to the fear that Americans were going to lose something that they had if we did anything for the 20% of the people that didn't have health insurance. So the plan that I have is based on what I think can pass and what we did in Vermont. I'd expand Medicaid to cover everybody under 25 who doesn't have insurance. If they want to keep their own insurance, they can, but they're eligible for Medicaid. You've got to raise reimbursement rates, otherwise every doctor and hospital goes broke. Prescription benefit for Medicare makes Medicare a pretty decent insurance package. And then between 25 and 65, simply give tax credits to small businesses so they can afford to get health insurance for their employees, and vouchers for individuals who work for themselves or who work for companies who don't get health insurance so they can go buy health insurance. It means you have to do to the insurance market what we did in Vermont. You have to have guaranteed issue so no insurance company can turn anybody down, and you have to have community ratings so a 50-year-old pays the same amount for health insurance as a 25-year-old or 26-year-old. If you do that, you will get something close to 96% of insurance. Then we can have a big fight about how to reform the system. The trouble is, if you have the fight first, the losers are always the 42 million people in America who have no health insurance, who go for another decade until another Democratic president comes along who wants to do something about health insurance. I just don't want those 42 million people to be the victims of our infighting anymore. I want to get everybody in the system first.
Now, of the 40 million more or less who are uninsured now, the statistics that I've seen are that about a third of them are people who can actually afford to buy health insurance for themselves. They tend to be young people who think they're going to live forever and don't feel that they have a responsibility. Would you make it mandatory for them to buy into the system? Shouldn't it work the way auto insurance works?
Well, auto insurance doesn't work. I have to carry something called
funny, the insurance company paid the claim on my car when a tree fell on it.
No, I think that's great, but I have to cover something called carry something called uninsured motorist coverage in case I get hit by an uninsured motorist. We have mandatory insurance laws. I expect you to do in Massachusetts and every other place. And what that means is about 10 or 15% of the people who can't afford it, who are usually low-income folks, get their insurance certificate, go down and get their car re-inspected, then go home and cancel their policy every 6 months or every year. So there's a significant percentage of people who don't have auto insurance, even though the law requires it. I don't think mandating anything. I mean, look, if any of you are from New Hampshire, you can't even get a mandatory motorcycle helmet law passed up there. I mean, people don't like to be told what to do by the government, and my plan is going to make the pharmaceutical companies mad, but you can't have everything. But it is passable because it's the lowest amount of political opposition engendering plan that I can think of. It doesn't have mandates in it. It's all kind of positive incentives. So the way we deal with a 23-year-old who's in the workforce that doesn't want to buy health insurance, and let's just say we'd give them $3,500 and they didn't want to kick in $500 of their own, is just give it to them. It's Medicaid. It's cheap as dirt. There's no reason not to do it. We did ours during a recession. I never heard of a 23-year-old that wanted to go to the doctor. If you give a 23-year-old a voucher, they'll find a way to spend it on a Harley-Davidson. Then they'll have to go to the doctor. I mean, it's just, there's no downside in just saying, look, you're born in America, you get Medicaid until you're 25 years old, and then we'll deal with what happens when you get older than that later on. So the whole thing, the whole plan that I have, there's nothing mandatory in it. There's no mandate for employers. There's no mandate for people to automatically buy it. There will undoubtedly be some people who choose to go without health insurance. They make the choice. If they really can afford it, we will give them an income-based voucher. If they can afford it, then they'll go bare and they'll risk their assets.
Well, this raises a larger question about the concept of leadership. You don't feel that it would be your job as President of the United States, as a national leader, to tell young people who can afford to have health insurance that it's their moral responsibility to kick into the system, if for no other reason than to ease community rating and to help pay for those who demand a lot more from the system, namely the elderly.
I think if the Bush administration has proven anything else, it's that people resent being lectured about morals from people like that. So I don't think it's my moral job. I don't think it's my moral job to do any of that stuff. What I think it's
how about their responsibility as citizens?
If they vote and they pay taxes and hopefully get involved in political campaigns, then they fulfilled that duty. But let me be serious about the health insurance piece for a second. I've got to sell this to the Congress, and I've got to get it through the Congress. And that's going to be hard enough. Convincing people that they ought to spend money on something they don't want to spend money on I don't think that's my job. Most people want health insurance. I'd like to have a presidency where we actually harness people's good instincts instead of lecture them about their bad instincts. I think you get further that way. What I'd like to do is say, look, under 25, look, I was 24 and 23 once. I remember what life was like. That health insurance is not something at the high end of my agenda. Cars, well, we won't get too salacious, but a few other things. But after 25, or at some point, people want health insurance. The problem is they can't find it. And I think we ought to tap into the part of people who say, I want to be responsible, instead of lecturing the ones that aren't. It's the problem with what I call the No School Board Left Standing bill. It's the problem with all the unfunded mandates. What politicians of both parties do this, it's not just the presidents that are doing this, but he automatically assumes that the best way to get anything done in public policy is to beat up on the 5% of the people who don't do the right thing and make it impossible for the 95% who want to do the right thing by putting us all in straitjackets. What I'd like to do is appeal to the 95% of people who want to do the right thing, show them some leadership, make it easier for them to do the right thing when they're struggling to do it, and then the 5% we'll deal with later. It's like arguing about two-tier health care systems. I hate to obsess about the fact that a few wealthy people will be able to get whatever they want. So what? Let them have it. That shouldn't inhibit us from doing the right thing for the 95% of the people who struggle every day to get the right thing.
You've said that you've talked about the people down south who drive around their pickup trucks with Confederate flags on the back. And you've said, what's the line, that there's no reason why they shouldn't be Democrats because their children have to go to school and they need health care as well. Why do you think they haven't been Democrats?
Because I think the Republicans, ever since 1968 with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, have divided us on race issues. Look, when I go to the South, I talk about race deliberately because I know the Republicans are going to talk about it with phone calls in 8 o'clock at night and got big guys saying if you haven't paid your rent, you better not vote because somebody's going to be after you, or are you a citizen, and all that kind of stuff they do. If we're going to have elections about race, we might as well talk about it openly. I want white males, particularly in the South, to come back to the Democratic Party. And the case that FDR made was, look, when was the last time you all got a raise? When was the last time your kids got decent health insurance? What kind of schools do your kids go to if you can't afford a private academy? We have a lot of things in common in this country. We've let the Republicans divide us too long. I want to talk about the things we have in common. It's economic justice. It's hoping our families will do better, hoping we have opportunities, pride in our country. Those are the things that unite all Americans. I'm not going to allow the Republicans to divide us anymore. I want to appeal to all Americans, not just the ones that have been traditional Democrats. And that's why I talk about white guys in the South who drive pickup trucks. We want your vote, too.
Now, you said on Meet the Press a few weeks ago, and this was in the context of gay partnership agreements, that you were not in favor of a national law to enforce that. And you said at that time, and I quote, "I believe each state has to come to grips with civil rights issues." Now, I think we both grew up during the civil rights era when states' rights was something that I think we probably both opposed. Where do you draw the line on this? You were, if I remember correctly, you also said that the Confederate flag issue in South Carolina was a matter of local choice. Where do you draw the line? Where does it become a national?
That's a little out of context. What I said was I don't like the Confederate flag flying there, but there's not much the president can do about it, so it's a matter of local choice. But that doesn't mean I support it, and I don't. Here's where I am on civil unions. I think the Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional because I don't think that the federal government has any business talking about partnership and marriage laws to the states. That's a state issue. So as president, even though I signed the nation's only civil unions bill, which guarantees gay and lesbian people the same rights. What the civil unions bill does is guarantee every American or every Vermonter the same rights as everybody else. A gay couple has the right to visit their significant other in the hospital. They have inheritance rights and insurance rights, and the same thing I have as a married person. Now, it seems to me that equal justice under the law, equal rights under the law, and equal protection under the law are something this country's founded on. So as president, what I would do is this. I would not tell states that they had to have civil unions or try to get that passed through Congress, because I think it's none of Congress's business, just the way DOMA was none of Congress's business. What I would say is you've got to find a way to make sure that everybody has equal rights under the law. We don't prescribe what that way is, and that the federal government should recognize civil unions because there's 1,500 rights that you can't get unless you're a married person, and those ought to be available to gay and lesbian people too.
So the federal government should recognize it?
The federal government should recognize civil unions, and I said that. But I don't think the federal government should force Minnesota and Alabama and California to have civil unions. That's their job. They have to figure out how to guarantee equal rights.
And you also feel that gun laws are a matter of local choice as well? Not
all gun laws. What I've said is that I support the assault weapons ban, and I think that I think it needs to be reauthorized. There'll be a big fight about that next year. I support the Brady bill, and I support closing the gun show loophole. But after that, I think every state ought to make their own gun laws. And here's why. In our state, we have no gun laws, essentially. We also have the lowest homicide rate in America. One year we had 5 homicides in the whole state when I was governor. Now, a state like that doesn't need gun control. You probably do in Boston. I know they do in New York. They love gun control in California, New Jersey, and Washington, D.C. So my attitude is, once you get past the federal laws, which everybody ought to support, which we should continue to support and enforce, every state ought to make as much or as little additional gun control laws as they want.
And what about the folks from Boston who go up to Vermont and buy handguns?
Well, that actually happened. What happened was, it hadn't happened in Vermont, but what happened was that New York did a survey about 15 years ago that showed that the significant majority of illegal guns in the city of New York were being bought in Virginia. So Virginia passed a law that made it harder to buy guns. I think that makes sense, but I'm not sure that you want to pass it. I generally am uncomfortable with laws that apply to all 50 states when they're not necessary in each of the 50 states. The education bill is a great example of applying Texas standards to places like Iowa, and that's a disaster.
Are you in favor of federal taxes on cigarettes?
Of course.
How would
as much tax on cigarettes as you can. I'm a physician, Joe.
How would you feel? How would you feel about a nice, fat, stiff federal tax on bullets, especially handgun bullets? $1 a bullet, maybe $2 a bullet.
I'm not sure $2 a bullet or $1 a bullet, but I'm not adverse to taxes. I mean, there are some other things. Cop killer bullets; those aren't necessary. Look, most people. I know if you say the NRA in Massachusetts, everybody goes hiss, boo, horrors. I got to tell you straight up, NRA members in Vermont are not the kind of people like Charlton Heston. They're hunters. They don't think you need an AK-47 to blow away a deer. And I got to tell you, we have done an enormous amount of conservation in our state. And the way I get these enormous conservation deals, hundreds of thousands of acres set aside for you all to come up and visit and use all the time, and us to make sure our state retains its rural character, is I go to the National Rifle Association, because they're hunters and they know you can't have hunting without habitat, and I use them to leverage against the right-wing property rights nuts in the legislature, and get the Republicans to support my conservation deals. Now, you've got to get your...
But aren't we talking about here... I mean, one of the major issues that any president has to face is the power of special interest groups.
Yep.
And every special interest group, whether they come from the left, right, or center, operates the same way, and that is they do not want to take one step back, even at the margins. On the right, it may be the NRA when it comes to handguns or gun locks. On the left, it's teachers' unions when it comes to teacher tenure or vouchers. How is there some...
Support the teachers' union. I mean...
You support them in all of their many demands?
No, not all of their many demands, but I don't want to see a voucher system destroy the public school system.
How about teacher tenure? How about...
Let me give you...
How about teacher tenure?
Teacher tenure is actually a great example, because Roy Barnes in Georgia got rid of teacher tenure. Now, I don't know anything about the school system in Georgia, but I do know that there's never been any call to get rid of teacher tenure in Vermont, because we don't have a problem. So why should the federal government decide that we're going to get rid of teacher tenure or not? Isn't that a local school board issue? Isn't that a state issue? Why is that a federal issue?
And if a local school board decides in the inner city that it wants to implement vouchers, you'd be in favor of that too?
No. Here's the problem with vouchers. Vouchers has national...
It's a local issue.
Yeah, but it has a national implication. Whether somebody has tenure in Boston or not, it doesn't have any effect on what happens in the Vermont school system. So if you all want to get rid of it, that's your business. That's certainly not the federal government's business. Vouchers are, and here's why. What a voucher system, in my view, does is the public schools are the last place in this country where everybody has to go to school with everybody else. Now, we avoid it, and our public schools are more segregated than they ought to be, but there's still, in many cases, lots of different people meeting together and learning about each other. They don't have to love each other, but they have to know something about each other. This is the most diverse country on the face of the earth. The truth is there are 5 big minorities in this country and no majorities, or there are now in California, and there will be in 50 years. African Americans, Anglos, Asian Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, and lots of other minorities. And the public school system is the last place they all go to meet. We've seen what vouchers have done in the South. They've essentially resegregated the school system. My great fear about vouchers is that You'll have the Catholics here, the Jews here, the Protestants there. You're going to have...
those weren't vouchers in the South. Those are just Christian academies in the South.
Yeah, but there's a huge movement for vouchers, and in some cases they actually...
But most of the movement for vouchers is in the inner cities, like places like Cleveland and Milwaukee, where parents don't feel that their children have the option of getting a good education.
It's true that there's some support in those places, but the truth is that most of the voucher systems weren't proposed by people in Milwaukee and Cleveland. They were proposed by conservative Republican governors in those states and rural capitals.
So they control the legislatures. Where has it ever passed?
It has passed. It is done in Milwaukee.
Yes, but it's been done by mostly Democratic city councils. It hasn't been conservatives who pass vouchers. It's been liberals.
It's been.
Why shouldn't they have
John
the right?
Norquist in Milwaukee I would not call a liberal, but we can get into that later, if you want.
But you would
Tommy
dispute the fact that
no.
most of the parents and local community groups in Cleveland and in Milwaukee and other cities you'd say that they are right-wing conservative?
No, I wouldn't say that, and I didn't say that. What I said is it's on the agenda of conservative Republicans. It is true that there is a lot of parental support in Milwaukee for the voucher program because people think that the inner city schools are a disaster. Here's what the downside is. The downside is that in the end of the day, schools resegregate themselves, as they are doing in Milwaukee, by race, by religion, by income, and in the end, the people left in the public schools system are the kids who need special ed, the one group of people that none of these private Christian academies will take. I don't think that's a great prescription for the most diverse nation on the face of the earth.
Let me take my interviewer's prerogative and tell one quick story. The fact is that conservative Republicans don't usually emphasize this issue for a very simple reason. In the 1988 presidential campaign, George Bush did focus groups. This is the elder George Bush. Did focus groups to see whether vouchers would be a great issue, a great wedge issue for middle-of-the-road and conservative voters, especially in the suburbs, the so-called Reagan Democrats. And what he found was that in Macomb County in Michigan, that mythical home of Reagan Democrats, nobody wanted vouchers because they didn't want their kids, they didn't want black kids coming out from the city to come to their schools. And so it has been pretty much confined to the inner cities where this public school system has failed miserably. Now let's move on to one last area, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. And that area is trade. You were on record in '95, and I think for many years after, as being a very strong supporter of NAFTA. And in fact, it has had very positive economic impacts on the northern border. However, I saw you in Iowa in October, and you said that fair trade is more important than free trade. And I heard you speak against NAFTA at that point. What caused you to change your mind about it?
Well, I haven't actually spoken.
And in general, how do you feel about the notion of free trade?
I haven't spoken against NAFTA, but your quotes are right. NAFTA was a big benefit to Vermont. We got a lot of.
I got to say, the union audience, I saw you doing that, saying that too, thought you were speaking against NAFTA.
No, what I said. Well, I'll tell you what I said in a minute, but I may follow my train of thought here most briefly. What I have said, free trade has benefited Vermont a great deal. Here's the problem with free trade, and here's why I support fair trade and why I want to change all our trade agreements to include human rights with trade, as Jimmy Carter included human rights with foreign policy. I still think NAFTA was a good thing, and I think the president did the right thing. But the problem now is that 10 years into NAFTA, here's what we've done. We have shipped a lot of our industrial capacity to other countries, and the ownership pattern and the ratio of reward between capital and labor in those other countries is what it was 100 years ago in this country. So the reason for NAFTA is not just trade, it's defense and foreign policy. That is a middle-class country where women fully participate in the economic and political decision-making of that country is a country that doesn't harbor groups like Al-Qaeda, and it's a country that does not go to war. And so that's in our interest. That's why trade is really in our long-term interest. What we've done so far in NAFTA is we've transferred industrial capacity, but we haven't transferred any of the elements that are needed to make a middle class. The truth is the trade union movement in this country built America, not literally, well, they did do it literally with the Brooklyn Bridge and the Empire State Building and things like that, but they built America because they allowed people who worked in farms and, in factories and mines to become middle-class people. And America was the strongest country on earth, and still is, because we have the largest middle class on earth with democratic ideals. That is, working people in this country, by and large, feel that this is their country and they have a piece of the pie, and it matters what they think. Now, if you want trade to succeed, ultimately, we're going to have to create a climate in other countries that are beneficiaries of NAFTA where they can create a middle class with democratic ideals. And that means we should not have any free trade agreements, and we should go back and tell the WTO that you need also to include environmental standards and labor standards. Here's what happens. Here's why. Today, if you run a factory in Iowa, let's just suppose you spend $1 million a year disposing of all the waste products that come out that are toxic. You can go to another country and dump all that stuff in the river and on the ground. So America, because we have environmental standards and we're willing to trade straight out, free trade, with countries that it's cheaper by $1 million before you even get to wages to do business there, I think that's a big problem. We're essentially saying our environmental laws are strict. It's cheaper for you to go to business someplace else. Go ahead. That's the wrong thing to do. The same with labor standards. I don't know why we should be shipping our jobs offshore when kids can work 12 hours a day, 7 days a week for a small amount of wages. And isn't that what America fought against 100 years ago? Wasn't that the victory of the trade union movement? So it seems to me that my position makes sense. We've gone through 10 years of free trade. We've gotten to a position where we now need to change our trade agreements.
The free traders, let me represent the Republican wing of the Democratic Party here, would argue back that what we get in return for free trade are lower prices that benefit every American, and number one. And number two, you get the beginnings of third world economic development, and it starts many countries on the path that, say, Japan took. I mean, remember, we were kids. Made in Japan was a sign of cheapness, and that country moved up the economic food chain as its workers took jobs in what we would call sweatshops, and then enabled their kids to be educated and moved on up and up. It's happening in China now. It's happening in India now. I've been to villages in the third world where, you know, there is a sweatshop that enables a mother to buy shoes for her kids and let them go to school. What would you say to that mother?
What I would say is we've gone the first mile. The first decade has worked for exactly the reasons you say. I don't disagree with the premise of the free traders. I had this discussion with Bob Rubin, and I said, here's the problem. We need an emerging middle class in these countries, and we're not getting one. So now is the time to have labor and environmental standards attached to trade agreements. He said, you're totally wrong. I can't disagree with you more. I said, well, how would you address the problem? I haven't heard back. You have to deal with this problem. It's a serious problem.
Well, let me ask you this. What if they just say
Here's
no?
what I would say.
What if they say no?
Well, then I'd say, fine, that's the end of free trade. We have an enormous...
What do you mean it's the end of free trade? Then we'd slap tariffs on these countries?
Yep.
So you'd be in favor of tariffs at that point?
If necessary. If you can't get... Look, Jimmy Carter did this in foreign policy. If you can't get people to observe human rights and say that we're going to accept products from countries that have kids working, no overtime, no time and a half, no reasonable safety precautions, I don't think we ought to be buying those kinds of products in this country. We're enabling that to happen. I'm serious. Look.
And so let me go back. Let's go back to those moms and kids. You would shut down all of those sweatshops.
It's not going to happen.
And you would put all of those people out of work.
We're going to end where we started with a hypothetical. It isn't going to happen. For the same reason that the way
One of the interesting things about presidential campaigns, political campaigns in general, is that in the end, most of it is hypothetical.
That's right. And here's why it's not going to happen. Because we already did what I want to do in health insurance. You get folks in the door as the first step. You make sure health insurance is an entitlement for everybody. Then, no matter how the Republicans try, they can't take away Medicare and Social Security. They're going to get beat up terribly over what they're trying to do. Once you get health insurance in the door, then we can fight about it and people aren't going to lose it. We already have trade in the door. You know why the countries aren't going to say, no, too bad for you, go ahead and put up tariffs? Because they're already in the door. Now, we've got them in the door. That's why I don't think my support of NAFTA 10 years ago was a bad thing, or 5 years ago was a bad thing. We've got them in the door. They're already seeing the benefits of trade. Now we're going to say to them, okay, now is the time that workers' rights and environmental rights matter. You have a choice. You can go back to the way it was if you want to. I don't think there are many governments that are going to take us up on that.
So bottom line, we can't tell Vermont to control handguns, but we can tell China to control environmental and
We're not
labor
telling China to control environmental. What we're saying is if you want to do business with us, we do have some morals, and we intend to enforce our view of the world.
Ah, I thought you didn't like talking about morals.
I like talking about my morals.
Let's go to questions. And there are microphones here. And let me give the usual and predictable. Don't give speeches, just ask questions. And if there are long lines, I'm going to take. Let's take, for starters, I think we have about 20 minutes. Let's take 2 questions at a time. The first 2 questions from that mic, which puts moral pressure on the questioner to be brief.
God, what a question.
My name is Michael Jovanovic, and I'm Serbian. As Serbian, I disapprove Clinton's going to Serbia without United Nations Security Council approval. And as an American, I disapprove that President Bush did the same thing.
Question, please.
Give me a chance. One of the newspapers in Boston said that you're a minor candidate. In my book, with only one exception, J.F. Kennedy, you're number 1 politicians in the last 50 years, not only among presidents, but of those who run for presidency.
Question, please.
Thank you.
Look, just look behind you. There is a long line of people who have questions. Let's make it a 1 or a 2 sentence question in each case, okay?
You spoke longer than I did.
Yeah, but he's the moderator. He spoke longer than I did, too.
And
I'm representing all of those people who are standing behind you.
Okay. Sir, you said that you approve a marriage between the same sexes. Do you approve that as a doctor, as a physician, or as a politician?
Okay, and let's take the question behind him.
We actually didn't approve of marriage between the same sexes. What our bill says is that marriage is between a man and a woman, but a same-sex couple may enter into a civil union and have all the same legal rights as people who are married. That's what we said.
Let me try and get a couple of questions out there, so we can just move.
Oh, okay.
My name is Peter Smith. I'm co-chair of the Coalition for a Strong United Nations. And in that light, my question is, what changes would you make in our current U.S. policies in general in relation to the United Nations?
Well, let me be blunt about this, as I usually am. I don't approve of the president going to war in Iraq without the United Nations, but the United Nations is not blameless in this. The United Nations really had not enforced the previous resolutions in terms of disarming Iraq. And the United Nations does have a mandate to use military force in Iraq as the United Nations because Iraq is a threat to countries in its own region, because it likely possesses horrible weapons, including not nuclear weapons, so it's not a threat to the United States, but chemical weapons, which makes it a threat to all the countries around it, including some in which they've used them on. So the way I would now try to reconstitute our relationship with the United Nations is simply to begin the dialogue and say, look, we're interested in being part of the United Nations again, but it's very important to us that when we make a resolution, that we enforce that resolution and that we learn from this very difficult experience that we've had in Iraq, that there are 2 parties here. The United States must really become a member of the world community, but the United Nations really does have to be serious about enforcement. I think it's important, frankly, that the United Nations go back and be really serious about the resolutions regarding Israel and Palestine. That actually works well for both people. Israel deserves an absolutely secure existence, and the Palestinians clearly are going to have a state. And I think most people agree with that, both on the Israeli and the Palestinian side. But that means that they have to be serious about that. They just can't talk about that. They have to do something about it.
Let's take the first 3 questions in this side over here.
Hi, I'm Ellen Hume from UMass Boston next door.
Hi, Ellen.
How are you, Joe? Very good program, thank you. Very quick question. If you're going to have a serious candidacy and actually try to win the presidency of the United States, you have to know the answer to this question. Why did the Republicans sweep the last election?
They didn't.
Let's get 2 or 3.
They seem to hold all the power these days.
Let's get 2 or 3, and then you can do them all.
those kids you were talking about that work 7 days a week, I assume that you agree that they do that because they're desperate and they're hungry. John McCain, after 9/11, said that hunger drives world terrorism. Why is world hunger never debated in politics?
Well, I would
And let's take one more, and then you
have
can
a hard time
Okay.
remembering
Here, you want-
all these questions.
Okay. The first one was the election. The election, hunger, and
Would you support a national gun registry of the type that might have caught the killer in the Washington, Virginia, and Maryland area?
Only if it would have. I've always said that I have no objection to signing gun legislation if somebody really is going to show that it saves lives, but I would want to be shown very seriously that it would, and I'm skeptical.
okay, how about the election?
The Republican sweep, there really was no Republican sweep, and the losses that we took were essentially because we had candidates who ran on the platform that they voted with the president 85% of the time. Well, if you're a Democrat running for the Senate and your platform is I voted with the president 85% of the time, why wouldn't you vote for the guy who votes for the president 100% of the time? And what was the other one?
The third one was hunger.
Oh, hunger. First of all, I disagree with John McCain. I don't think world hunger fuels terrorism. What it fuels is sympathy for terrorism. Terrorism is people who are terrorists are, in some ways, I don't know if psychopathic would be fair to say, but they have something clinically the matter with them. I mean, because they use just causes to justify murder of innocent people. There's no justification for that under any circumstances, whether it's hunger or poverty. It's like saying, well, poor people commit crime because they're poor and they're desperate. That doesn't happen very often. Poor people have the same, and hungry people have the same sense of morality that everybody else does. It's hunger that fuels sympathy for terrorists, and in that degree, I totally agree with you. And there are some things we can do about it, and that we ought to be doing about it, and they range all the way from food programs to population control programs, and we need to have a much better handle on that, and we, frankly, ought not to be afraid to mention in public discourse the word condoms once in a while.
Let's take a couple from this side. You'd rather just answer them as they come.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's just make them quick, and he'll answer them as they come.
I'll be as brief as I can. You made a number of, my name is Aaron Goldstein, you made a number of speeches leading up to the war, and you characterized American involvement as unilateral. Given the fact that we have the support of the British, the Spanish, the Australians, the Italians, and most of Eastern Europe, and given that there are now British casualties that have been sustained in this war, do you still characterize our involvement as unilateral?
Well, the reason I do, and we've gone back and forth with Tim Russert and others on that, is that Tom Friedman, who I respect enormously, also uses that word to describe it. And I agree. Technically, you could say, well, it's preemptive and there's a coalition, although Eritrea and Uzbekistan don't exactly strike me as a large expansion of the coalition. But the reason I call it unilateral is because it's clearly being driven by the United States, driven hard by the United States. And if it were not for the United States' enormous interest in this, there would be no war in Iraq. So that's why I use the word unilateral. Technically, I could use a different word, but since Friedman chose to use that word, I felt like I was justified because I have a lot of respect for his view on foreign policy.
Sir, what do you think is the root cause of Arab-Muslim terrorism against the United States, and what is your policy to correct it?
Well, given what I just said about the nature of terrorists, terrorists are terrorists first. They may have a cause, but there's no justification for the murder of civilians in any circumstances. So the root cause of terrorism is some kind of psychological, deep-seated problem and willingness to do unspeakable things to other human beings. The things that motivate them have a lot to do with their nature of their own government, feeling powerless in a world, being involved in an institution that, like many institutions, has trouble changing and adapting to a modern world. In some cases, being indoctrinated to hate with a substitution of ideology for ambiguity, which is always in a difficult world for folks who are struggling, is always a temptation. So there are a lot of recruitment ways that terrorists recruit people, but the cause, I would never connect the cause of actual terrorist acts with deprivation or powerlessness.
Hi, Mr. Dean. My name is Lou Giordano. I was wondering if you'd share with us just a few highlights from your energy strategy for the nation. Specifically, what domestic goals would you have beyond preserving ANWR and conservation policies to get us off foreign oil?
Sure. There are really 3 or 4, depending on how you want to count them. Or actually, you can break them down into 2. One is conservation, the other is alternative and renewable energy. The renewable energy will take a little longer to come on. 16% of all the electricity in Holland is windmills. The Germans get enough electricity from wind to replace 5 or 6 nuclear power plants. We don't do hardly anything, really, in that regard, and we need to. It partly means we've got to build some transmission infrastructure from the windiest part of our country, which is the Midwest, to the big cities like Minneapolis and Chicago. But we can do a lot more with wind. We can do a fair amount more with solar. We ought to have tax credits. We ought to have net metering, which is basically you can plug your source into the grid and sell it to the power company for what they charge you when you're not using it. Those are all ways of paying down the investment early. The most important thing we need to do is oil conservation. There are 2 things you can easily do. One is if you substitute 10% ethanol in everybody's gas tank in America, that we use so much gasoline that actually reduces world use of oil by 2%. That's a big, big number. If you don't like using ethanol because it has high BTUs to convert starch to sugar, just use sugarcane, which is the Brazilians have done it for years. There's little pain associated with that because you don't have to retool cars' engines. Secondly, if you had mileage standards on SUVs and trucks, the same as I'm not asking Americans to leave their SUVs and trucks, but next year, with a hybrid engine, a Ford Escape is going to be out that gets 37 miles to the gallon. And if you were lucky enough to get the Bush tax cuts, a Lexus will be out, which has a hybrid engine in it. It's true, and a Toyota for those in the mid-range. So there really is an opportunity immediately, without an enormous amount of pain, to institute significant conservation measures, both in terms of fuel substitution and in terms of mileage standards.
Forget this side.
Good evening. Susan Donahue with your Rhode Island meetup group. In other venues, you fully set out your opposition to No Child Left Behind. What role do you envision for the federal government in the administration of schools, specifically addressing schools that may be broken down when you become president?
Well, we have a different approach to education. I think No Child Left Behind probably ought to be undone in its entirety. It's an unfunded mandate, which I see that Congress is desperately funded now. But the truth is they do a whole lot of other things in that bill that are not funded. They require all kinds of advanced degrees for paraprofessionals and teachers. There's no funding for that. They require every school to certify they allow quote-unquote constitutionally guaranteed school prayer. This is something that local school boards can decide upon, and our folks voted for all this. What I would do is this. I'd use a high standards test. In our state, we use a test that not one school in the state meets standards on. I did that on purpose. I wanted the suburban schools to struggle, not just the inner city schools, and they do. Everybody has to improve education. Secondly, we provide some money for improvement in the standards, for training and so forth, when they get their scores. Thirdly, we're more interested in testing schools, not individuals, so we don't have high stakes. I see you're having a big controversy here that if you don't pass the max or whatever it is, you don't graduate. We leave that to individual school boards. The state sets a standard. We want to measure what schools are doing. If you teach to our test, you've actually improved education because the stuff on our test is stuff people ought to know, so we don't worry about that. We also don't want to discriminate against a kid who's a fantastic artist but may not have an aptitude for math. That's really up to the school boards to decide what they should do. The one thing that the federal government should do to improve education is there ought to be a national standard, which you can exceed, and it ought to be a very high national standard, because 9 times 9, as far as I know, is 81 in Massachusetts, same as it is, I think, in Texas.
It's more in Texas.
More in Texas? It's less in Texas. So there's no reason not to have a national standard, but if we could only do one thing in education, if we could only do one thing, which would allow smaller classes, better paid teachers, and lower property taxes, we ought to fully fund special education. If you only did that. Now, you all know that I'm a fiscal conservative and I want a balanced budget. How can I talk like this? The cost of the federal government is $27 billion out of a $2.2 trillion budget. I think if we can give $670 billion in tax cuts, we can probably find $27 billion to fund local schools, and that's what I want to do.
Thank you.
There's a feeling here that you will be president in 2004. And as president, how will you work to eliminate the proposed tax cuts that the Bush administration has proposed? And also, are you in favor of tax rebates rather than tax cuts?
Well, right now, I don't think we can afford to reduce the revenue of the federal government anymore at all unless you want to give up Medicare, Social Security, and even ultimately defense. I think that we're really in a deep hole here. Here's what I would do. If you say to people, do you want to get rid of the president's tax cut? They say no. If you say you have a choice between the president's tax cut or a prescription benefit for your mother or father, you have a choice between fully funding special ed and maybe lowering your property taxes or the president's tax cut. You have a choice between funding the 20% of the cut that Massachusetts took this year in federal highway allocations or the president's tax cut. Most people are going to say, well, I'll take the roads or the schools or the health care, because most people didn't get much of a president's tax cut. I had a guy in New Hampshire one time I gave this spiel to, and he got up and he said, well, Governor, I got to admit, you do make some sense. I remember that check for $600 that I got from the president, but my 401k went down $60,000. I think I was better off before the president's tax cut.
You're, let me just intervene. You're for the balanced budget amendment?
And
if so, how would you do a balanced budget in these circumstances in a recession?
You'd have to have a glide path for the balanced budget amendment, for a balanced budget. We don't actually. Vermont is the only state in the country that doesn't have a balanced budget amendment or balanced budget language, and yet we probably had the best balancing of our budget in the last 12 years of any state, because we used most of the extra money to pay off debt and to put into a rainy day fund. Now, I don't really like the idea of a balanced budget as public policy, but I'm so desperate because every time there's a Republican president, he runs us into enormous debt. So I think the Democrats ought to support a balanced budget amendment.
We're going to take one more question, I'm sorry, because we are heading to 5:30.
Good evening, Governor Dean. My name is Lori Timor-Berry. I'm chair of the Cambridge Democratic City Committee. We've been trying to enact a jobs creation commission for the last 8 years, and this deals with the aspects of income disparity that you mentioned. And I would like to know so much, what else besides the threat of civil unrest is going to bring the venture capitalists and the business people to the table to talk about this trend that seems to be growing even greater and greater? Thank you.
Well, I don't think it's going to take civil unrest to do that. I think it's just going to take a change in government and a change that are sanctioned by the American people. I don't know specifically about the program that you have in Cambridge, so it's hard for me to comment on that. What I'd like to see is a commitment to a community again. I mean, what I often talk, when I often talk to small groups, I talk about the obligation and the responsibility that we have to each other. That is, I want a country again where we admit that we are responsible for each other and to each other. We were sort of off on this lonesome cowboy routine, rugged individualism. Well, the truth was, even in the frontier days, rugged individualism wasn't what ruled the communities. There wasn't a lot of government, but when somebody's barn burned down, everybody was there the next day to try to build a new one and try to make sure the family had a place to stay. The rhetoric, the anti-government rhetoric of the Republicans since 1980 has really hurt this country. I'd like to say that government has some pretty important functions. One of them is to make sure that there's such a thing as a minimum wage. Another is to make sure that there's such a thing as standards so that people can't be exploited. Another is to make sure that there's a fair distribution between those who invest and those who work. Now, government did pretty well under Roosevelt and under Kennedy and under Johnson and even under Nixon, who proposed the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is an incredibly important piece.
A guaranteed annual income.
And he proposed a guaranteed annual income. So there was at one time a compact between Americans that said we have some responsibility, that we expect each other to work and to contribute, but we also expect that we're in some way going to be responsible for each other and for each other's children.
Thank you.
We've lost that. I want to do better, and I want to bring it back to America. I want to bring us back to an America where we do admit that we do have responsibility for each other and each other's children.
I think we're going to have to end it there, but as a journalist, let me give a very specific thank you, and maybe on the behalf of the audience as well, which is...
May I ask a question, Mr. Governor?
Wait a second. I think we've just had the last question.
Wait a second.
Do you want to take it?
I'd like you. I want to vote for you. I like all your positions. I read all your speeches.
Question.
And I think that all the issues that we worry about, you worry about, and you're going to go across the country and bring those to the attention of the people that haven't
Question.
voted. Wait a second. I finished. And are you going to be able to raise... all my friends say, great guy, but he never can raise the money to make this thing go. Now, can you? And Bush has $150 million in the kitty right now to do it. Can you beat that?
Thanks. I really appreciate your asking the question. It was well worth it. Go to deanforamerica.com, deanforamerica.com, and you can contribute now.
No, that was the last question. Let me just say in closing that as a journalist, I've seen an awful lot of politicians in recent years who've talked legislatees and focus group and market test, very few who speak English. I think that what we've seen here is a candidate who speaks English, and I look forward to hearing you speak more of it as we go down the road.
Thank you. Thank you very much.